But it's my distinct pleasure to introduce a couple of folks from Apogee Corporation. As we heard earlier this morning, I think there really is an inversion of what's happening in the firm. And one of the world's leading firms on API, the API economy, is Apogee. And it's a distinct pleasure that we actually have their lead designers and the CEO of the organization to actually discuss what's happening in the economy, what the strategies for this are. Indeed, they're going to be participating in some research in what's the value of APIs in the API economy, so we can actually try to put some precise numbers on how these things are growing. And with that, so let me introduce Chet Kapoor, the CEO of Apogee, and Brian Kirchner, also with Apogee.
Thank you.
Brian, I've forgotten your title.
Nice. Brian goes by the title of Top Dog, so you can just call him that. So I just want to check if the presentation is there. Marshall, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I got a chance to see Marshall's presentation earlier, and I concluded at the end of it that I should not give my presentation and just have Marshall do it, because he actually covered everything we were going to talk about. Apogee is about a 10-year-old company. We recently went public. We are learning how to be a platform business. And I say learning because I think for anybody who's ever run a platform business and not just talk about it, knows that it is an ongoing process. You have to continue to evolve and to innovate with, I think, we talked about Facebook, we talked about MySpace. I think even people at Facebook would tell you today that it is a learning process, and people at Google will tell you the same thing, and other places. So we are learning how to be a platform business. We have the opportunity to serve hundreds of customers and have some very strategic partners like Accenture. We have some of our customers here in the audience as well, and are humbled that we get the opportunity to be part of their digital journey every day. So we have, we're going to walk through a little bit of the journey that we see, and we're going to come at it from a practitioner's point of view on how we help our customers think about platform businesses and platform ecosystems. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we've seen happen historically. Some of that will be repetitious, but I think it'll be very useful. We'll talk a little bit about what some of our customers are actually doing and the benefits they're getting by having an ecosystem which is very data-oriented. Then going to talk a little bit about apps itself, and a little bit about technology, because we cannot help ourselves. That's what we do for a living. And then talk about exactly how it all comes together for a 100-year-old company to actually get into being a platform business. So Brian Kirchner actually was not expecting to come and present with me. We pulled him in. He doesn't know he's actually doing the entire presentation. But now he does. Actually, he found out 30 seconds ago. And so Brian's going to kick off the presentation. I'll drive the rest. Brian actually leads something that we put together a few years ago with a gentleman by the name of Sam Ramji, who's also in the audience, called the Apogee Institute. That's collaborates very closely with our customers as well as with our partners like Accenture. And we talk about best practices and how companies become platform businesses. So Brian's going to kick off the presentation, and then I'll take it from there.
All right, thanks, Chet. So I do have a great job. I get to collaborate with people like Marshall. I get to work for Chet. Did you get that on tape? We spend a lot of time with our customers trying to identify not just what their questions and challenges are, but how they've answered those questions or overcome those challenges, and how we can turn those patterns and practices into validated best practices. But we don't just look across what different companies and different industries are doing now. We also try to put things into historical perspective, to look at some examples of previous change, times of disruption, and how companies turn technological disruptions into growth. So we're in a time of change, digital, mobile, clouds, changing the market context. But technology has changed the market context before, and when we look back at some cases, we see there tend to be three types of companies: those who simply fail to adapt and may disappear, those who adopt the new technology and remain competitive but don't fundamentally disrupt the industry they're in, and those who build their businesses around the change to fully harness it, or in the case of incumbents, who rebuild their company. So I'm going to look back at a couple cases from the past where companies were sort of harnessed technological changes for explosive growth. These are companies that became disruptive to their industry. So in 1956, the United States started to build the interstate highway system as we know it. It was a 35-year project to build almost 50,000 miles of modern highway. That drove tremendous change in behavior. In California alone, from 1950 to 60 to 70, vehicle miles driven rose from 44 billion to 71 billion to 101 billion. And that wasn't just people driving around the same patterns they drove around before. Because of suburbanization, you got the ubiquity of the commute. You got Sunday drives. You got driving kids to and from baseball practice. And there's a company that rode that technological change to tremendous growth. So the golden arches, as we know them, had their origins in the early 50s. That's when they were designed and conceptualized. But it was in 1960 where Ray Kroc's Look for the Golden Arches marketing campaign became a tremendous accelerator of growth because he was directly addressing these changed patterns of driving and behavior. And so on your morning commute, on your road trip with your kids, it became the place you could look for consistent quality service and anywhere you were in the country. While McDonald's started as what we would call a drive-in its very early days, the drive-through as we know it had its origins in the 70s and quickly rose to become half of McDonald's revenue at the time. So in that era, for a particular change, McDonald's disrupted really the food and eating industry, not just their competitors you would think of as restaurants, but actually competing with people eating at home. It really changed how people consumed food. We were talking to a reporter at CNN a couple weeks ago, and she said, APIs are really the secret sauce behind a lot of digital experiences we all enjoy today, but many people don't appreciate that or know about them. And I think there's a sister technology in containerization. Right? So containerization dates to only really the 70s when it really started to take off. And prior to that, shipping things around the world was actually a very cumbersome, manual, and fairly inefficient process compared to what it became. And so during the 70s and 80s, there was exponential growth of containerization. The Economist recently estimated it actually drove more global trade than any negotiated agreement. It was simply the fact that it became so compelling to build global supply chains. And there is a company that rode this wave of innovation that embraced it and adopted it to build not just an incredibly efficient supply chain that wouldn't have been possible before, but also to take advantage of the fact that containerization drove the creation of this international ecosystem of suppliers. Right? So they became fantastic at managing this lean, efficient, highly competitive in the sense of suppliers competing for Walmart's attention supply chain. In 1972, they went public with $78 million in revenue. In 1980, they celebrated their first billion-dollar year of sales, and in 1993, their first billion-dollar week of sales. So during this period of expansion of trade, they mastered its implications for the supply chain. Paul Dougherty mentioned this morning, he's on the board of the Computer Museum. I think our graphics people might have gotten this picture from him. But it's deliberately chosen because what we wanted to evoke here is the era of computing before mobile as we know it, before tablets as we know them, really the early days of the internet, when the internet was starting to become a household word. And there was someone, Jeff Bezos did not grow up dreaming of selling books. As the internet began to become ubiquitous, he was actively thinking about what type of business could I get into to leverage the internet and disrupt existing businesses. Books was one of the things on his list, and that's where Amazon started. But Amazon didn't stop there, right? So they harnessed the internet in its early days and subsequently to be tremendously disruptive. And finally, a very current example working up through history. This is a company whose success, whose existence would have been completely implausible, and to most of us in developed markets did them this tremendous favor of, at our own expense, securing a connected GPS device. And once the folks did that, Uber seized on that and has enjoyed explosive growth. And what's fascinating about Uber is it took on an industry that in the US you would think of as incredibly fragmented, highly regulated at a local level, essentially frozen in amber for 100 years. But nonetheless, despite the fact that they've run into some hurdles and in some countries provoked riots, they've enjoyed absolutely phenomenal growth. Those are some historical examples as context for talking about how companies can become platform companies today.
I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about Uber, giving you our point of view, but I think it's been talked about enough. Companies are rebuilding their businesses around digital, a lot of them, and they actually come. I really love this. I love this thing from Gartner, which is that tells you that every industry, no matter what it is, right? The web actually did not disrupt everybody consistently, right? The one thing about digital, it's going to actually disrupt everybody, and it started with music. And with books, and I think it's going to go all the way down to mining. We're actually seeing this happen not just in forward-looking companies, but across the board. A lot of people are paralyzed, but there are many, many who are actually taking advantage of this. And they come from many, many industries, right? Obviously, retail being first, but it's happening in things, companies like BBC, where all their content is available to everybody in the UK through something called the iPlayer. And they're actually becoming a content platform above and beyond just being, just going off and actually and creating content and going in and having come through TV. Pearson's is another one. They've realized that they're getting disrupted in a very big way, and they have to go off and do much more than they already have. And Swisscom is another one. As a monopoly in Switzerland, they have realized that if they don't create an ecosystem, they will have competition and they will get disrupted, and they think about digital as a way to get them there. Some of our favorite examples are companies like Walgreens. It's really interesting. Walgreens is a phenomenal success, and it continues to be. They recently bought Boots in the UK. Lots of great stats on this slide, right? And the one that I want to bring your attention to is the 6x. Walgreens customers that actually use their mobile app, use their web app, and go to the store spend 6 times as much. Let me pause. 6 times as much as any other customer that just goes to the store. That is the benefit that they are getting by going off and becoming digital. It is very significant. What is very, very interesting for Walgreens is that they didn't start that way. And one of the things that we tell our customers is, it's instead of going off and doing this massive planning on how I'm going to become a digital company, is start walking the path, because you actually don't know where you would land. If you talk to Walgreens executives, they wouldn't tell you that they started with a vision of being going off and being a platform for health, right? That's how they think of it today. But they started walking the path. They started with something called quick prints, right? They wanted to make sure that you could actually not just go and upload pictures, you could actually do it, not upload, take pictures on your phone, upload them on the website. You want to do it directly from the phone. And here they are, their royalty numbers are going up. And it all comes down to the way they use data, right? They pick up a lot of information about Chet Kapoor when he's using the mobile app, when he's going on the website, as well as when he goes to the store. And how do they make that information available so that it actually shows up in the fitness app that I'm using tomorrow, right? And that's what Walgreens does phenomenally well. Another great example of that is Burberry, and they're obviously on the very high end, and Angela now runs retail for Apple, but she kicked off digital being a catalyst of everything they do. And they didn't start by knowing the answer. The first thing that they did was they took all the information they had about all their customers and made it available to developers internally at Burberry, and said, what can we do with all this data? And what the developers at Burberry came up with was, let's do a clienteling app, right? Let's go off and so that when you walk into a Burberry store, the associate knows everything about you. And what's interesting is now they're enhancing the app of not just knowing what their experience has been with you, they're actually going to pick up data about you, with your permission, obviously. They're going to pick up data about you and try to match that to your buying patterns when you're in the store. So it's really interesting how Burberry is using data as well to get more and more digital. One of my favorite examples is Nike. When we started working with them, they actually said they had a very clear vision. They wanted to go from building a better shoe to a better you, right? And this was a few years ago. And Nike's digital strategy has really, really played off. They have over 28 million folks in the community, a lot of people registered, and all they're doing is collecting information. They know exactly every city and country I've run in. They know how often I run, and with that comes really good recommendations of buying shoes when the soles are worn out. So really interesting things that Nike is doing with data as well. What is interesting is all our customers start like this. They all have a system of record. And this is the technology part of the presentation. They all have a system of record. It's taken them years to make it work. It is great technology. It's hard to get it to work, and they now have it working. What is interesting is that the people on the top are folks who want the connected experience. They want to be able to interact with the company, whether you're in the B2B business or you're in the B2C business. They want to interact at the pace that they interact with apps in their consumer life, in their regular private life. And that is what we call the pace of the App Store. They expect apps to be updated every 2 weeks. They want new features. They want new things. The pace of the App Store is what consumers are expecting today. And this creates a tremendous amount of impedance mismatch between what everybody wants and what enterprises can deliver. And a lot of people call this bimodal IT. We call it two-speed IT. And what lands up happening is people try to take these system of records and repurpose them to go off and create these experiences as connected experiences for customers, and that is generally very painful. The only way to solve that problem is actually to have platform technologies. And by the way, this is not a plug for Apogee. It is a question of how you solve the problem is create a layer that sits on top of your system of record, because the system of record was not designed to do things like this. These platform technologies are used by developers. And these developers come in different shapes and forms. They come as cloud developers, they are mobile developers, they are data developers, they are API developers, all these different kinds of developers. Because let's face it, if software is taking over the world, developers are making it happen. We've all seen 18,000 different variations of this slide, right? The story between Apple and BlackBerry. I use it in my keynotes all the time. You can look at it from units sold. You can look at it from developer interactions. But you can see the difference between iOS, Android ecosystems and what happened with BlackBerry. And obviously, Windows is trying to get some lift nowadays. But developers are not just conquering apps on the mobile device. They're actually conquering everything, right? If you look at what developers are doing, as a company that's based in Silicon Valley, you see where developers are spending time. And not just developers that are from startups, but actually from companies like Ford, like GM, that actually have innovation centers either in Detroit or they actually have them in the Valley. They're doing cars. They're doing cities, right? And developers are literally taking over the world in all aspects of it. These developers need to be served. You cannot think of, I will build it and they will come. You have to serve the developer community. And it becomes really important. It becomes really important for every business to have a vibrant developer ecosystem. Now, this is a variation. This is as we've worked with hundreds of enterprises, we have seen this. I should have put my Apple Watch on airplane mode because it keeps vibrating. Every business needs we've noticed that it is not just important to have an external ecosystem, but you should have an internal ecosystem as well. As Thaddeus Arroyo, who's the CIO of AT&T, said, Chet, we have 30,000 developers internally. I'd like to make sure that I can get 10% productivity increases just from them and see what they can innovate before I start going outside as well. Now, 30,000 seems like a small number compared to millions of developers that somebody would get. But having those inside your firewall and trying to make something happen with them can actually give you a tremendous amount of boost as you go forward. So you need a developer ecosystem, and my request to everybody in the audience is think of it not just externally, but internally as well. And think about having a developer ecosystem strategy internally for your developers, whether you have 1,000 developers, 500 developers, or you have 20, right? Think of that way. And developer ecosystems, this is the virtuous cycle, and it works really well. This is well understood. Developers work on platform technologies, and they build apps. And as they do that, the more you actually crank the cycle, the more data is produced, right? You get data about what apps they're building, what developers are productive, what parts of the technology are being used, and data is what becomes the center of creating an ecosystem as you go forward. What's interesting is they're all building apps, right? They're all going off and building apps. But the nature of apps is changing, right? Where did apps start from? Angry Birds, right? That's what apps used to be. They would just be the value of the app was the app itself. In the web world, we would have called it brochureware, right? Or now it was an interactive version of it. It was just that. By the way, still a big leap forward from anything before, but that's all it did. The next version, and where we are today, is what we call the companion app, right? You have some kind of you have a car, you have a device, you have something where your app now is actually connected. It's not standalone, it's connected to something else. It could be a back-end server, right? But you're actually doing something more substantial than just running something on your mobile phone. You're connecting to something else. It's a companion app for something else that needs to get done. We think the future is the data app. The data app is the value is about combining all kinds of data. Doesn't mean you won't actually have something running on a mobile phone. Doesn't mean you won't connect to the back end. But how do you bring the data from the back end and from systems above and beyond ones that you have control of, and bring them together to actually create a data app of the future? So what do 100-year-old companies have in common? What do 100-year-old companies have? They have a lot of data. They have a lot of data sitting around. Unfortunately, it is all in the system of record. They have great value chains. Over years, they've worked really well. They've squeezed out the profits of all of them. And now they've created a system of record, websites being included in there, web channels being included in there. It's all there. This entire value chain that every 100-year-old enterprise has to get merged with the new realities of digital. Whether you're in the B2B business or whether you're in the B2C business, you have to interact ultimately with somebody who has a bunch of devices around them. So we think that bringing these two things together requires platform technologies and very vibrant developer ecosystems. And that's how 100-year-old companies like Walgreens, like Nike, and like Burberry, and many others, Swisscom and others, are going off and making that happen. So the answer is liberated data, a vibrant like agile, absolutely agile platform technologies, and a vibrant developer ecosystem is how a company goes off and gets into the platform ecosystem, or actually goes off and starts the journey of becoming a platform business. Thank you. We wanted to rush the presentation because we wanted to actually leave some time. I noticed in the sessions before, the Q&A was actually very helpful. So I think we've successful in trying to do this in enough time. If you have any questions, we'll take them. Should do this slide.
If I can ask the obvious question, here you have the stored records, the legacy system. You're going there with a clear value proposition. You've got the data. What's the dominant source of resistance to exploring the potential value of APIs to open up and create greater access, transparency, et cetera? What's the 20% of the reaction that accounts for 80% of the resistance?
Many different words come to mind, all meaning the same. Momentum, this is the way it has been done. This is the way it shall be done. Fear, I might not have a job, but it's all around people. The resistance always is somebody saying, but that's not how we've done things. And we find that the way to break that through is not to actually go off and do a big bang approach. The first thing is you absolutely need what we call the blessing of God. So the CEO or the board has to become a board or a CEO level initiative to actually go off and try to make that change. That's one. The second thing is you absolutely need a change agent. We call them digital change agents. You need somebody who has operational responsibility, has vision, and has enough credibility inside the organization to actually drive it. A lot of people call that a chief digital officer. And then the third thing is you need to make sure that you do baby steps, because the antibodies are always waiting in the wings. They're always waiting in the wings to say, I told you so, right? And this is, it's something that we see consistently. But to answer your question, it's always around people. The technology part, we now have enough momentum. That's actually the easier part of the equation. The harder part is actually making sure that you sidestep the people issues or actually work through the people issues as you become successful.
And I mean, I would add, I think in part it is, you've seen our thesis is that data is an incredible asset to establish companies in this new digital platform world. But it's about embracing that as truly an opportunity. And so it does require doing things differently. And a story I always like to tell is about Nike. And it's been a little complicated because I always ask, when was the last time you saw a Nike TV commercial? They've done very, very few TV commercials lately. They've shifted hundreds of millions of dollars from traditional advertising to digital connections, right? Social media connections to the Nike Fuel platform where they have a one-to-one relationship with their customers. They were great at commercials. I mean, you remember Just Do It, you remember Bo Knows, they were awesome. But they saw an opportunity to do things better. Now, it's been complicated by the fact that there are times, like the Super Bowl or the Women's World Cup, where a TV is a great mass advertising opportunity. And you may have seen their commercials during the Women's World Cup. You can go see them on YouTube, speaking of digital. But it was amazing. It's one of the best commercials you'll ever see. But I think it comes back to prove the point, is they were willing to shift, to adopt, to change the locus of power within the company about how they relate to customers, to shift to digital. That's a big cultural operational shift to make.
Very much so.
So I'll ask the last question before Sangeet joins us, which is, so I just want to follow up on Michael's point. I think the people point is a great one, but every time we go to a reasonably complex, kind of 100-year-old organization that you've described, they're very vertically oriented.
Yeah.
They've got incentives that align vertically,
Correct.
and they often have technology stacks and these systems of records that are even incompatible across their own organization. And maybe you could just speak a little bit to some of the challenges in building these critical horizontal data layers that enable this sort of more unified customer-facing experience.
We can spend a lot of time talking about the different disparate technologies and how we actually bring them together and how we make it easier and how the architecture works. But I'll go back to what I said earlier. If there is this is software, right? And doing software at scale is hard, but that's why companies like Apogee exist. This is why companies like Apogee grow, because doing things like this are hard at scale. The hardest part, again, is actually if you have the mandate from the top, you will actually be able to break through silos and work through the technology issues. In some cases, healthcare, there was healthcare being a good example of one that is an absolute pain in the ass, right? Because they're arcane systems that are very old, and they need to be integrated with. But again, I'll go back to technology is generally not the hardest part. It takes longer in some industries versus not. Retail is an example where it doesn't take as long because they actually were hit by the web pretty hard, and so they actually reinvented themselves in the early 2000s, and so getting them into mobile has not been the hardest part. Healthcare, on the other hand, did not have, the web did not have much of a impact on them, and they have to be, there's a lot more that needs to be done. So I think for us, it always comes down to, do we have a business driver, a business executive actually going off and saying, making it happen?
Thank you.
Questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.